Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading from Galactic Cluster, an anthology of science fiction short stories by James Blish. This time we continue our reading of Beep. Our protagonist, Mr. Weinbaum, has just discovered that the cranky old scientist who has been refusing to discuss his sources of information is really the beautiful young journalist who has been refusing to discuss her sources of information. Disguise is a wonderful thing. If Dana Lee had any idea of what she was in for, and considering the fact that she was J. Shelby Stevens, it had to be assumed that she did, the knowledge seemed not to make her at all fearful. She sat as composedly as ever before Weinbaum's desk, smoking her eternal cigarette, and waited, one dimpled knee pointed directly at the bridge of the officer's nose. Dana, Weinbaum said, this time we're going to get all the answers and we're not going to be gentle about it. Just in case you're not aware of the fact, there are certain laws relating to giving false information to a security officer, under which we could heave you in prison for a minimum of 15 years. By application of the statutes on using communications to defraud, plus various local laws against transvestism, pseudonymity, and so on, we could probably pile up enough additional short sentences to keep you in Yafank until you really do grow a beard. So I'd advise you to open up. I have every intention of opening up, Dana said. I know practically word for word how this interview is going to proceed, what information I'm going to give you, just when I'm going to give it to you, and what you're going to pay me for it. I knew all that many months ago, so there would be no point in my holding out on you. What you're saying, Miss Lee, Thorwald said in resigned voice, is that the future is fixed and that you can read it in every essential detail. Quite right, Dr. Wald. Both of those things are true. There was a brief silence. All right, Weinbaum said grimly. Talk. All right, Captain Weinbaum. Pay me, Dana said calmly. Weinbaum snorted. But I'm quite serious, she said. You still don't know what I know about the Dirac communicator. I won't be forced to tell it by threat of prison or by any other threat. You see, I know for a fact that you aren't going to send me to prison or give me drugs or do anything else of that kind. I know for a fact, instead, that you are going to pay me. So I'd be very foolish to say a word until you do. After all, it's quite a secret you're buying. Once I tell you what it is, you and the entire service will be able to read the future as I do, and then the information will be quite valueless to me. Weinbaum was completely speechless for a moment. Finally, he said, Dana, you have a heart of purest brass, as well as a knee with an invisible gun sight on it. I say that I'm not going to give you my appropriation, regardless of what the future may or may not say about it. I'm not going to give it to you because the way my government, and yours, runs things makes such a price impossible. Or is that really your price? It's my real price, but it's also an alternative. Call it my second choice. My first choice, which means the price I'd settle for, comes in two parts. A, to be taken into your service as a responsible officer, and B, to be married to Captain Robin Weinbaum. Weinbaum sailed up out of his chair. He felt as though copper-colored flames a foot long were shooting out each of his ears. Of all that, he began, there his voice failed completely. From behind him, where Wald was standing, something like a large Scandinavian model guffaw was being choked into insensibility. Dana herself seemed to be smiling a little. You see, she said, I don't point my best and most accurate knee at every man I meet. Weinbaum sat down again slowly and carefully. Walk, do not run to the nearest exit, he said. Women and childlike security officers first. Miss Lee, are you trying to sell me the notion that you went through this elaborate hanky-panky, beard and all, out of a burning passion for my dumpy and underpaid person? Not entirely, Dana Lee said. I want to be in the Bureau, too, as I said. Let me confront you, though, Captain, with a fact of life that doesn't seem to have occurred to you at all. Do you accept as a fact that I can read the future in detail, and that, to be possible at all, means that the future is fixed? Since Thor seems to accept it, I suppose I can too, provisionally. There's nothing provisional about it, Dana said firmly. Now, when I first came upon this gimmick quite a while back, one of the first things that I found out was that I was going to go through the J. Shelby Stevens masquerade, force myself onto the staff of the Bureau, and marry you, Robin. At the time, I was both astonished and completely rebellious. I didn't want to be on the Bureau staff. I liked my freelance life as a video commentator. I didn't want to marry you, though I wouldn't have been averse to living with you for a while, say a month or so. And above all, the masquerade struck me as ridiculous. But the facts kept staring me in the face. I was going to do all those things. There were no alternatives, no fanciful branches of time, no decision points that might be altered to make the future change. My future, like yours, Dr. Wald's, and everyone else's, was fixed. It didn't matter a snap whether or not I had a decent motive for what I was going to do. I was going to do it anyhow. Cause and effect, as I could see for myself, just don't exist. One event follows another because events are just as indestructible in space-time as matter and energy are. It was the bitterest of all pills. It will take me many years to swallow it completely, and you too. Dr. Wald will come around a little sooner, I think. At any rate, once I was intellectually convinced that all this was so, I had to protect my own sanity. I knew that I couldn't alter what I was going to do, but the least I could do to protect myself was to supply myself with motives. Or, in other words, just plain rationalizations. That much, it seems, we are free to do. The consciousness of the observer is just along for the ride through time and can't alter events, but it can comment, explain, invent. That's fortunate, or none of us could stand going through motions which were truly free of what we think of as personal significances. So I supplied myself with the obvious motives. Since I was going to be married to you and couldn't get out of it, I set out to convince myself that I loved you. Now I do. Since I was going to join the Bureau, I thought over all the advantages that it might have over video commentating and found that they made a respectable list. Those are my motives. But I had no such motives at the beginning. Actually, there never are motives behind actions. All actions are fixed. What we call motives, evidently, are rationalizations by the helpless observing consciousness, which is intelligent enough to smell an event coming, and since it cannot avert the event, instead cooks up reasons for wanting it to happen. Wow, Dr. Walls said, inelegantly, but with considerable force. Either wow or balderdash seems to be called for. I can't quite decide which, Weinbaum agreed. We know that Dana is an actress, Thor, so let's not fall off the apple tree quite yet. Dana, I've been saving the really hard question for last. That question is how? How did you arrive at this modification of the direct transmitter? Remember, we know your background, where we didn't know that of J. Shelby Stevens. You're not a scientist. There were some fairly high powered intellects among your distant relatives, but that's as close as you come. I'm going to give you several answers to that question, Dana Lee said. Pick the one you like best. They're all true, but they tend to contradict each other here and there. To begin with, you're right about my relatives, of course. If you'll check your dossier again, though, you'll discover that those so-called distant relatives were the last surviving members of my family besides myself. When they died, second and fourth and ninth cousins though they were, their estates reverted to me. And among their effects, I found a sketch of a possible instantaneous communicator based on de Broglie wave inversion. The material was in very rough form and mostly beyond my comprehension because I am, as you say, no scientist myself. But I was interested. I could see dimly what such a thing might be worth, and not only in money. My interest was fanned by two coincidences, the kind of coincidences that cause and effect just can't allow, but which seem to happen all the time in the world of unchangeable events. For most of my adult life, I've been in communications industries of one kind or another, mostly branches of video. I had communications equipment around me constantly, and I had coffee and donuts with communications engineers every day. First, I picked up the jargon, then some of the procedures, and eventually a little real knowledge. Some of the things I learned can't be gotten any other way. Some other things are ordinarily available only to highly educated people like Dr. Wald here, and came to me by accident, in horseplay, between kisses, and 100 other ways, all natural to the environment of a video network. Weinbaum found, to his own astonishment, that the "between kisses" clause did not sit very well in his chest. He said with unintentional brusqueness, "What's the other coincidence?" "A leak in your own staff." "Dana, you ought to have set that to music. Suit yourself." "I can't suit myself," Weinbaum said petulantly. "I work for the government. Was this leak direct to you?" "Not at first. That was why I kept insisting to you in person that there might be such a leak, and why I finally began to hint about it in public on my program. I was hoping that you'd be able to seal it up inside the Bureau before my first rather tenuous contact with it got lost. When I didn't succeed in provoking you into protecting yourself, I took the risk of making direct contact with a leak myself. And the first piece of secret information that came through to me was the final point I needed to put my direct communicator together. When it was all assembled, it did more than just communicate. It predicted. And I can tell you why." Weinbaum said thoughtfully, "I don't find this very hard to accept so far. Pruned of the philosophy, it even makes some sense of the J. Shelby Stevens affair. I assumed that by letting the old gentleman become known as somebody who knew more about the Dirac transmitter than I did, and who wasn't averse to negotiating with anybody who had money, you kept the leak working through you, rather than transmitting data directly to unfriendly governments. Well, you'd better name me that leak before the man gets away. When the price is paid, not before. It's too late to prevent a getaway anyhow. In the meantime, Robin, I want to go on and tell you the other answer to your question about how I was able to find this particular Dirac secret and you didn't. What answers I've given you up to now have been cause and effect answers, with which we're all more comfortable, but I want to impress on you that all apparent cause and effect relationships are accidents. There is no such thing as a cause and no such thing as an effect. I found the secret because I found it. That event was fixed. That certain circumstances seem to explain why I found it in the old cause and effect terms is irrelevant. Similarly, with all your superior equipment and brains, you didn't find it for one reason and one reason alone, because you didn't find it. The history of the future says you didn't." "I pays my money and I takes no choice, eh?" Weinbaum said ruefully. "I'm afraid so, and I don't like it any better than you do. Thor, what's your opinion of all this?" "It's just faintly flabbergasting," Wald said soberly. "However, it hangs together. The deterministic universe which Miss Lee paints was a rather common feature of the old relativity theories, and as sheer speculation has an even longer history. I would say that in the long run, how much credence we place in the story as a whole will rest upon her method of, as she calls it, reading the future. If it is demonstrable beyond any doubt, then the rest becomes perfectly credible, philosophy and all. If it doesn't, then what remains is an admirable job of acting, plus some metaphysics, which, while self consistent, is not original with Miss Lee." "That sums up the case as well as if I had coached you, Dr. Wald," Dana said. "I'd like to point out one more thing. If I can read the future, then J. Shelby Stevens never had any need for a staff of field operatives, and he never needed to send a single direct message which you might intercept. All he needed to do was to make predictions from his readings, which he knew to be infallible. No private espionage network had to be involved." "I see that," Weinbaum said dryly. "All right, Dana, let's put the proposition the other way. I do not believe you. Much of what you say is probably true, but in totality, I believe it to be false. On the other hand, if you're telling the whole truth, you certainly deserve a place on the Bureau staff. It would be dangerous as hell not to have you with us. And the marriage is more or less a minor matter, except to you and me. You can have that with no strings attached. I don't want to be bought any more than you would. So, if you will tell me where the leak is, we will consider that part of the question closed. I make that condition not as a price, but because I don't want to get myself engaged to somebody who might be shot as a spy within a month. Fair enough, Dana said. Robin, your leak is Margaret Soames. She's an Erskine operative and nobody's bubble brain. She's a highly trained technician. Well, I'll be damned, Weinbaum said in astonishment. Then she's already flown the coop. She was the one who first told me we'd identified you. She must have taken on that job in order to hold up delivery long enough to stage an exit. That's right, but you'll catch her day after tomorrow. And you are now a hooked fish, Robin. There was another suppressed burble from Thor Wald. I accept the fate happily, Weinbaum said, eyeing the gun sight knee. Now, if you will tell me how you work your Swami trick, and if it backs up everything you've said to the letter, as you claim, I'll see to it that you're also taken into the Bureau and that all charges against you are quashed. Otherwise, I'll probably have to kiss the bride between the bars of a cell. Dana smiled. The secret is very simple. It's in the beep. Weinbaum's jaw dropped. The beep? The Dirac noise? That's right. You didn't find it out because you considered the beep to be just a nuisance and ordered Miss Soames to cut it off all tapes before sending it to you. Miss Soames, who had some inkling of what the beep meant, was more than happy to do so, leaving the reading of the beep exclusively to J. Shelby Stevens, who thought she was going to take on Erskine as a client. Explain, Thorwald said, looking intense. Just as you assumed, every direct message that is sent is picked up by every receiver that is capable of detecting it. Every receiver, including the first one ever built, which is yours, Dr. Wald, through hundreds of thousands of them, which will exist throughout the galaxy in the 24th century, to untold billions of them, which will exist in the 30th century, and so on. The Dirac beep is the simultaneous reception of every one of the Dirac messages which have ever been sent or ever will be sent. Incidentally, the cardinal number of the total of those messages is a relatively small and, of course, finite number. It's far below really large finite numbers, such as the number of electrons in the universe, even when you break each and every message down into individual bits and count those. Of course, Dr. Wald said softly. Of course. But, Miss Lee, how do you tune for an individual message? We tried fractional positron frequencies and got nowhere. I didn't even know fractional positron frequencies existed, Dana confessed. No, it's simple, so simple that a lucky layman like me could arrive at it. You tune individual messages out of the beep by time lag, nothing more. All the messages arrive at the same instant in the smallest fraction of time that exists, something called a chronon. Yes, Wald said, the time it takes one electron to move from one quantum level to another. That's the Pythagorean point of time measurement. Thank you. Obviously, no gross physical receiver can respond to a message that brief, or at least that's what I thought at first. But because there are relay and switching delays, various forms of feedback, and so on in the apparatus itself, the beep arrives at the output end as a complex pulse which has been splattered along the time axis for a full second or more. That's an effect which you can exaggerate by recording the splattered beep on a high-speed tape, the same way you record any event that you wanted to study in slow motion. Then you tune out the various failure points in your receiver to exaggerate one failure, minimize all the others, and use noise suppressing techniques to cut out the background. Thorwald frowned. You'd still have a considerable garble when you were through. You'd have to sample the messages, which is just what I did. Robin's little lecture to me about the ultrawave gave me that hint. I set myself to find how the ultrawave channel carries so many messages at once, and I discovered that you people sample the incoming pulses every thousandth of a second and pass on one pip only when the wave deviates by a certain way from the mean. I didn't really believe it would work on the Dirac beep, but it turned out just as well. 90% as intelligible as the original transmission after it came through the smearing device. I'd already got enough from the beep to put my plan in motion, of course, but now every voice message in it was available and crystal clear. If you select 3 pips every thousandth of a second, you can even pick up an intelligible transmission of music. A little razzy, but good enough to identify the instruments that are playing, and that's a very close test of any communications device. There's a question of detail here that doesn't quite follow, said Weinbaum, for whom the technical talk was becoming a little too thick to fight through. Dana, you say that you knew the course of this conversation, yet it isn't being Dirac recorded, nor can I see any reason why any summary of it would be sent out on the Dirac afterward. That's true, Robin. However, when I leave here, I will make such a transcast myself on my own Dirac. Obviously, I will, because I've already picked it up from the beep. In other words, you're going to call yourself up months ago. That's right, Dana said. It's not as useful a technique as you might think at first because it's dangerous to make such broadcasts while the situation is still developing. You can safely phone back details only after the given situation has gone to completion, as a chemist might put it. Once you know, however, that when you use the Dirac, you're dealing with time, you can coax some very strange things out of the instrument. She paused and smiled. I have heard, she said conversationally, the voice of the President of the Galaxy in 3480 announcing the Federation of the Milky Way and the Magellanic Clouds. I have heard the commander of a world line cruiser traveling from 8873 to 8704 along the world line of the planet Hatshepsut, which circles a star on the rim of NGC 4725, calling for help across 11 million light years. But what kind of help he was calling for, or will be calling for, is beyond my comprehension. And many other things. When you check on me, you'll hear these too, and you'll wonder what many of them mean. And you'll listen to them even more closely than I did, in the hope of finding out whether or not anyone was able to understand in time to help. Weinbaum and Wald looked dazed. Her voice became a little more somber. Most of the voices in the Dirac beep are like that. They're cries for help, which you can overhear decades or centuries before the senders get into trouble. You'll feel obligated to answer every one, to try to supply the help that's needed. And you'll listen to the succeeding messages and say, will we get there in time? Did we understand in time? And in most cases, you won't be sure. You'll know the future, but not what most of it means. The farther into the future you travel with the machine, the more incomprehensible the messages become. And so you're reduced to telling yourself that time will, after all, have to pass at its own pace before enough of the surrounding events can emerge to make those remote messages clear. The long run effect, as far as I can think it through, is not going to be that of omniscience, of our consciousness being extracted entirely from the time stream and allowed to view its whole sweep from one side. Instead, the Dirac, in effect, simply slides the bead of consciousness forward from the present a certain distance. Whether it's 500 or 5,000 years still remains to be seen. At that point, the law of diminishing returns sets in, or the noise factor begins to overbalance the information, take your choice, and the observer is reduced to traveling in time at the same old speed. He's just a bit ahead of himself. You've thought a great deal about this, Wald said slowly. I dislike to think of what might have happened had some less conscientious person stumbled on the beep. That wasn't in the cards, Dana said. In the ensuing quiet, Weinbaum felt a faint, irrational sense of letdown, of something which had promised more than had been delivered, rather like the taste of fresh bread compared with its smell, or the discovery that Thorwald's Swedish folk song Natt och Dag was only Cole Porter's Night and Day in another language. He recognized the feeling. It was the usual emotion of the hunter when the hunt is over, the born detective's professional version of the postcoitum Trieste. After looking at the smiling, supple Dana Lee for a moment more, however, he was almost content. There's one more thing, he said. I don't want to be insufferably skeptical about this, but I want to see it work. Thor, can we set up a sampling and smearing device such as Dana describes and run a test? In 15 minutes, Dr. Wald said. We have most of the unit in already assembled form on our big ultrawave receiver, and it shouldn't take any effort to add a high-speed tape unit to it. I'll do it right now. He went out. Weinbaum and Dana looked at each other for a moment, rather like strange cats. Then the security officer got up with what he knew to be an air of somewhat grim determination and seized his fiancee's hands, anticipating a struggle. That first kiss was, by intention at least, mostly pro forma. But by the time Wald padded back into the office, the letter had been pretty thoroughly superseded by the spirit. The scientist harumphed and set his burden on the desk. This is all there is to it, he said, but I had to hunt all through the library to find a Dirac record with a beep still on it. Just a moment more while I bring in the connections. Weinbaum used the time to bring his mind back to the matter at hand, although not quite completely. Then two tape spindles began to whir like so many bees, and the end stopped sound of the Dirac beep filled the room. Wald stopped the apparatus, reset it, and started the smearing tape very slowly in the opposite direction. A distant babble of voices came from the speaker. As Weinbaum leaned forward tensely, one voice said clearly and loudly above the rest, "Hello, Earth Bureau. Lieutenant T.L. Matthews at Hercules Station, NGC 6341. Transmission date 13/22/2091. We have the last point on the orbit curve of your dope runners plotted, and the curve itself points to a small system about 25 light years from the base here. The place hasn't even got a name on our charts. Scouts show the home planet at least twice as heavily fortified as we anticipated, so we'll need another cruiser. We have a can-do from you in the beep for us, but we're waiting as ordered to get it in the present. NGC 6341 Matthews out." After the first instant of stunned amazement, for no amount of intellectual willingness to accept could have prepared him for the overwhelming fact itself, Weinbaum had grabbed a pencil and begun to write at top speed. As the voice signed out, he threw the pencil down and looked excitedly at Dr. Wald. "7 months ahead," he said, aware that he was grinning like an idiot. "Thor, you know the trouble we've had with that needle in the Hercules haystack. This orbit curve trick must be something Matthews has yet to dream up. At least he hasn't come up with it for me yet. And there's nothing in the situation as it stands that would indicate a closing time of 6 months in the case. The computers said it would take 3 more years." "It's new data," Dr. Wald agreed solemnly. "Well, don't stop there in God's name. Let's hear some more." Dr. Wald went through the ritual, much faster this time. The speaker said, "Nausen Tampen, Eden Topic, Barolissum, I'm Katechok, San Bekauma, Dat Tekamla, Don Commission, out." "My word," said Wald, "what's all that?" "That's what I was talking about," Dana Lee said. "At least half of what you get from the beep is just as incomprehensible. I suppose it's whatever has happened to the English language thousands of years from now." "No, it isn't," Weinbaum said. He had resumed writing and was still at it, despite the comparative briefness of the transmission. "Not this sample, anyhow. That, ladies and gentlemen, is code. No language consists exclusively of four-syllable words. Of that you can be sure. What's more, it's a version of our code. I can't break it down very far. It takes a full-time expert to read this stuff, but I get the date and some of the sense. It's March 12th, 2022, and there's some kind of mass evacuation taking place. The message seems to be a routing order." "But why will we be using code?" Dr. Wald wanted to know. "It implies that we think somebody might overhear us, somebody else with a Dirac. That could be very messy." "It could indeed," Weinbaum said, "but we'll find out, I imagine. Give her another spin, Thor." "Shall I try for a picture this time?" Weinbaum nodded. A moment later, he was looking squarely into the green-skinned face of something that looked like an animated traffic signal with a helmet on it. Though the creature had no mouth, the Dirac speaker was saying quite clearly, "Hello, Chief. This is Thamos, NGC 2287. Transmission date Gore 60302 by my calendar, July 2nd, 2973 by yours. This is a lousy little planet. Everything stinks of oxygen, just like Earth. But the natives accept us, and that's the important thing. We've got your genius safely born. Detailed report coming later by Paw. NGC 2287 Thamos out." "I wish I knew my new general catalog better," Weinbaum said. "Isn't that M41 in Canis Major, the one with the red star in the middle? And we'll be using non-humanoids there. What was that creature, anyhow? Never mind, spin her again." Dr. Wald spun her again. Weinbaum, already feeling a little dizzy, had given up taking notes. All that could come later. Now he wanted only scenes and voices, more and more scenes and voices from the future. They were better than aquavit, even with a beer chaser. And we'll get more scenes from the future and what people think about them next time.